Aaron Rodgers provides an update about his future with the Jets and his future in the NFL. How much of an update was it really? You can decide today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Friday, January 17th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Well, we have a number of updates today. We have some news on the Jets coaching search. We have some news on the Jets general manager search. But let's begin by talking about Aaron Rodgers, who provided what I would describe as sort of an update about his status yesterday on his weekly segment on the Pat McAfee show. So Rodgers talked about his future with the Jets and his future in the National Football League. Rodgers said, I think everyone understands it's going to come down to the GM and the coach and myself and whether we all want to do a dance together or if it's not in the cards. So, Rodgers kind of stating the obvious there. The Jets have to want him back. And a new general manager, a new coach, it's just tough for me to see a scenario where somebody new comes in and decides that they want to keep Rodgers, in part because Rodgers has been the face of the franchise the last 2 years. Literally everything the Jets have done has been with Aaron Rodgers in mind the last 2 years. And when you get new people into an organization, they want to run the show themselves. They want to do things their way. They want to be the star. A new coach wants to be the face of the organization. To an extent, a new general manager wants to be the face of the organization. They don't even want the perception that somebody else is driving it. And I feel like as long as Aaron Rodgers is here, the perception is going to be that, everything is about him, because that's the way it's been the last 2 years with the New York Jets. And, that doesn't even go into the other implications, because a new coach and a new general manager typically want to start fresh. They want to get their own people in here. Rodgers obviously is somebody they would inherit, and a new coach and general manager are typically thinking to the future. And if you bring Rodgers back, he comes with a $37.5 million price tag. You raise his dead money hit to over 60. That's over $60 million in 2026 if he retires after the season. And the idea that they brought Rodgers back last year, that's a big driver as to why Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas returned. For the reasons I mentioned, that Saleh and Douglas were just happy to have jobs. So it didn't matter if somebody else was driving the organization. Rodgers could be the number one guy there, because the alternative for Saleh or Douglas would be to be gone. It's very difficult to bring in a new coach and GM and keep a force as big as Rodgers around, especially when Rodgers is so far past his prime. Rodgers also indicated he's had very limited communication with the franchise, which kind of tells you where things are. Rodgers mentioned, as far as my own decision, I've told them it's going to take some time. They have not made a decision on the GM or coach yet. Once that happens, then it will take us to the next step, which is a conversation, I'm assuming, with whoever that individual is. So Rodgers is not undecided whether he even wants to continue playing. It's difficult to get into Aaron Rodgers' mind, but very possible that he's going to retire. The Jets will need a decision after they hire their coach and GM. They'll want to have this lined up before the offseason begins one way or another. But it's difficult for me to see like a coach or a GM wanting to bring Rodgers back. And, there's this school of thought out there that if you eliminate all the other stuff, all the other side stuff, that Rodgers, just in terms of football, is the best option for the Jets in 2025. There are people who say that, he's far and away the best option. One question I hear all the time is, who are you going to get who's going to play quarterback as well as him? And it just tells me that there's a disconnect between the perception of Rodgers and the reality of Rodgers right now. And I think a lot of this goes to the national media. And one of the ironies of Aaron Rodgers, if you watch him, is that he creates the perception that he's like this incredibly criticized. He's this oft criticized quarterback, that there's no player who's more criticized in the league than him. In reality, the national media is exceptionally deferential to him. The national media is very, very hesitant to criticize him at all. I mean, you can see this when you watch a game. I mean, how many times this year did Rodgers barely outrun a 300-pound defensive tackle and throw the ball away? And you hear the analyst on the game saying, wow, Rodgers' mobility looks great. I mean, there were so many times this season where I was watching something happen and Rodgers looked bad, and the analyst was telling me he looks really good. And this has been true, I think, through much of his career. Now, there hasn't been much to criticize through his career. I mean, he's obviously an immortal player in the league. But there is even like the few moments where he could be criticized. It's always somebody else's fault. When Peyton Manning had one Super Bowl up until his final season, it was because Peyton Manning didn't come through in big games, according to the national media. Rodgers only having one Super Bowl is the fault of the coach and the teammates. And you see it manifest itself in so many ways. But one of the interesting things was I started comparing Rodgers' statistics to some other quarterbacks this year. So there's a quarterback in the league right now who had a better completion percentage, a better yards per attempt, a better QBR, and more yards per game. Rodgers had a better passer rating by 2 points. So Rodgers' was 90.5, and this quarterback's was 88.6. Rodgers also had a better touchdown to interception ratio than this quarterback. The mystery quarterback I'm naming is Kirk Cousins. So again, Cousins beat Rodgers in completion percentage, yards per attempt, QBR, yards per game. Their passer rating was just about equal within 2 points of each other. Rodgers had him better than on touchdowns to interceptions. Everybody thinks Kirk Cousins should be gone from Atlanta. I mean, how many times did I hear Kirk Cousins is washed up this year? I'll give you another quarterback. There's another quarterback out there who had a better completion percentage, a better yards per attempt, a better passer rating, a better QBR, a better interception rate, and the same touchdown rate. Rodgers had an average of 4 more yards per game than this quarterback. And their success rates was Rodgers 43.9 and the mystery quarterback 43.6. So almost the same success rate. The second mystery quarterback is Russell Wilson, who I think everybody in Pittsburgh wants gone. And Russell Wilson had some moments during the season, just as Aaron Rodgers had some moments during the season with the Jets, but the whole picture was not very good. And I keep seeing this online now. There's always some meme like Aaron Rodgers, quote unquote, washed, and they cite his statistics. The problem is the statistics that they cite are never very good. I mean, I just gave you the numbers there. Aaron Rodgers' season was comparable with Russell Wilson and Kirk Cousins. And this is the quarterback that's going to be impossible to replace. This is the quarterback people are saying it's going to be impossible to find somebody who will play as well as him. So you should consider bringing him back. I just named you 2 quarterbacks who very well could be gone from their teams, 2 quarterbacks who most of their fan base wants them gone, 2 quarterbacks who really, the perception was that they were just really bad. And I think sometimes the Aaron Rodgers label just leads to this misperception. The fact it's Aaron Rodgers, just leads people to think it's better than it really is. And again, I think this goes back to the national media never wanting to criticize him because this was just a bad season. People say, well, he finished the season strong. Yeah, look, he played very well that final game against Miami. He had a few moments. The first Miami game was good. He had a good last 4 minutes against Jacksonville. He wasn't very good in the Jacksonville game. But yeah, when he faced some bad defenses, he showed he can still make plays. But it's not like he trended up. It's not like it was a total trend up near the end of the season. I mean, think about the way he played against Seattle. Think of the way he played against the Rams. Think of the way he played against Buffalo. When he faced good defenses, he couldn't get it done anymore. And I think it's just a sign that this is an iconic player, a guy who's obviously going to the Hall of Fame, a guy who will go down as one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the league, but a guy who can't really do it at a high level consistently anymore. Yeah, he can have a good game, but he can't. I don't think he can string together a 17-game season. And the idea that that's going to change when he's 1 year older, when he's 41 and will turn 42 during the season, when he will now be 4 years removed from his last MVP season, it's a tough argument to make. And I think that it's clear that the Jets need to separate from Rodgers for a lot of reasons. Again, he's the driving force behind the franchise. Financially, he makes no sense to bring back. But the notion that Rodgers is far and away the best quarterback, if you eliminate the finances, if you eliminate the side distractions, Rodgers is far and away the best quarterback on the field in 2025 for the Jets, I don't know that there's a lot to back that up because I just named you 2 quarterbacks. I'm not saying Kirk Cousins was better than Aaron Rodgers. I'm not saying Russell Wilson was better than Aaron Rodgers. I'm saying they were about equal. And nobody would be signing up for Kirk Cousins or Russell Wilson right now. So those are just what the numbers are. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to somebody who has worked in the Packers organization for during Aaron Rodgers' tenure there, and somebody who now could be in the mix for the Jets general manager job. There's a new candidate to evaluate. We'll evaluate him as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action. That's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the place to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns, and a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or want to cash out quickly, Prize Picks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions of winnings, it's clear that people are loving this platform. Here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space. LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. New episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And just because the season over doesn't mean we're stopping. A lot of Jets news to get to. Jets are searching for a new head coach and a new general manager right now. And it's really tough to follow this because it feels like things change every day. It's like one day Brian Flores is going to be the head coach. The next it's going to be Aaron Glenn. And, next day, no, it is Flores, and you can bring Ryan Grigson with him as the GM. And then Mike Bergonzi from Kansas City is the next GM. Then it's Alec Halaby of the Eagles. Tough to follow. A new candidate has emerged this week for GM. It is John Eric Sullivan, who is the vice president of player personnel with the Green Bay Packers. And he's worked with the Packers since 2003. He actually started as an intern in training camp for the Packers in 2003. And in that time, he's worked his way up. He's become football operations. He worked in the football operations department. He's become a regional scout. He became the director of college scouting, the director of player personnel, and now vice president of player personnel since 2022. I think one thing that I would guess, and it's an educated guess, is that if anybody from the Packers front office got the job as general manager of the Jets, what little chance of Aaron Rodgers returning would disappear, because Rodgers famously feuded with that front office his final years in Green Bay, especially after they drafted Jordan Love back in 2020. As I mentioned, Sullivan, a long history in the Green Bay front office, a guy who seems to have a lot of respect across the league. He's not just interviewing for the Jets job. He's in the mix for the Tennessee Titans. There is a big concern I'd have for bringing somebody in from Green Bay. And that's especially true of somebody who's spent an entire 2-decade career in Green Bay, as Sullivan has. And it's just like the dynamics of the team are so different in Green Bay. I don't think you could find a franchise where there is such a drastic difference in the way the team is run between the Green Bay Packers and the New York Jets. The Green Bay Packers, of course, play in the smallest market in the major North American professional sports. The Packers are like a relic to the early days of the NFL, where a lot of the teams were from these small Midwestern towns. It was more of like a local league. And almost pretty much all of those teams eventually folded or moved to bigger cities. The Green Bay Packers are the one exception. They're the one team that's kind of stayed in the small town Midwest, which means there's not a big media glare. Now, I know technically they're like Milwaukee's team, but Green Bay is a small market. It's a beloved team in a small town. It's a team that, the old expression puts Green Bay on the map is overused, but it's actually true in this case. The second dynamic is that the Green Bay Packers do not have a traditional owner like the other 31 teams do. The other 31 teams all have an owner. The Packers are publicly owned. They sell every couple of years when they, if they want like an expansion on Lambeau Field or something, if they want to raise money, they put shares of stock available up for sale for the team. So the Packers are a publicly owned team. They're not a team where you have to answer to an owner. And you think about it, these things make a big difference in the way the team functions. And in some ways, like Green Bay is like an ideal job. There's only been one team over the last 2 decades which has twice drafted a quarterback in the first round and sat him for 3 years to develop. It happened with the Packers with Aaron Rodgers in 2005. It happened again with the Packers 15 years later when they drafted Jordan Love. Rodgers originally sat for 3 years behind Brett Favre. Love sat for 3 years behind Rodgers. This is a team that's actually drafted a quarterback early. It hasn't just paid lip service to the idea we're going to develop him. They have developed these quarterbacks from the bench and from the practice field. And I think a lot of that is due to the dynamics of Green Bay, because in any other market, and it's not just New York, I mean, it's pretty much any other team, you're going to deal with a media that wants to know, when are we making the change? And you'll have an owner who will ask, we drafted this guy. Why isn't he playing? Now, it makes it a little bit, it's one thing that's made it easier is that the Packers both times had a Hall of Fame quarterback as their incumbent starter. Brett Favre, of course, was an iconic player, and so was Aaron Rodgers. So it makes it easier to not go to the rookie in those situations. But the counter to that is in both cases, the Packers were able to be forward thinking. They were able to draft a quarterback before they needed one. They didn't need to wait for the quarterback situation to reach a crisis point. They could be happy. They could still be happy with the quality of quarterback play they were getting. They still had Brett Favre, who had a couple of years left in him. They had Aaron Rodgers, who had a couple of years left in him. And at the time, the national media, there were a lot of people who questioned both of those picks. There were people who questioned the Packers drafting Rodgers. They said, why wouldn't you load up around Favre for his last run? And of course, in 2020, 15 years later, nobody had learned the lesson because they were saying the exact same thing. Why wouldn't you load up around Rodgers for his last run? Well, when you don't have an owner to answer to, and when the local media, maybe not the national media, but when the local media is so easy to deal with, you can actually think forward. You can think to the long run. You can think about building your team without being criticized for these things. Because in the NFL, a lot of the fans and a lot of the media are very short-sighted. They only care about that year. And winning in the NFL, building a consistent winner, requires a long-term balance. It requires you to balance the here and now with the future. And that's something the Packers have been able to do probably better than any other organization because of what I just laid out. With the Jets, it's the total opposite. With the Jets, it's all about the here and now. And the here and now doesn't mean like this season when the games start. The here and now means the reaction the media will have right now during the offseason when you make a move. And a lot of that is ownership driven. I think it's also driven by the market, though, because you look across sports. You can go to any sport. The New York teams are always obsessed with buzz. They're always obsessed with winning the back pages. They're always obsessed with the praise from talk radio. It's just part of the dynamic in this city. It's a big city. There's a lot going on. Teams feel that they need to get attention. Teams feel that they need to create buzz. So I think on the one hand, Sullivan comes from an organization that does things very well. A very forward-thinking organization, an organization that's professional, an organization that knows what they're doing. I mean, look at the Rodgers negotiations where the Packers kind of had their backs against the wall. They had to trade Rodgers. There was no team that was interested other than the Jets, and somehow they were able to squeeze the Jets for a couple premium draft picks. That was good negotiating by Green Bay. And Packers think forward. The question is, like, can somebody from that dynamic understand what they're getting themselves into in New York with the Jets? Because it is like a completely different world. That would be my concern with John Eric Sullivan. Now, as always, when you talk about these GM candidates, it's really tough to like judge them because unless you're the guy with the final say, unless you're the GM or whoever's in charge of football operations, it's very difficult to like get a sense as to who's behind what decision. You could be recommending all the wrong things, and the guy in charge could just be ignoring you, and that's the reason the team's good. Or you could be in a bad front office. You could be in like the Jets front office. You could be like the one voice. You could be like maybe if there's one voice of sanity who's telling the Jets don't do this stuff, and they're ignoring you. You might be good. So it's always difficult to judge these guys. But I think with Sullivan, it's more a question of how would he adapt if he got the job. Now, again, it's difficult to say who the front runner is because like every day there's like a different first tier, but there have been a couple of suggestions that Sullivan's in the mix for this job. So something worth watching and things to consider as the Jets consider him. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the coaching search. Jets completed a couple of interviews, and the interviews that they conducted yesterday had a similar theme. We'll discuss that as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only available in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. Let's turn our attention to the Jets coaching search. No real end in sight to the Jets coaching search right now. The Jets right now are not able. The NFL rules are really weird about this, and I guess they have to be because it's kind of a balance. But the Jets cannot meet in person with anybody with any playoff team until next week, or any team that's still playing until next week. So they've been conducting a lot of virtual interviews with these candidates. I think like the unofficial deadline you want to get a coaching staff in is not now. It's around like the Senior Bowl, because you want to at least know like what systems are going to be in place before the start of the Senior Bowl. So I know there's a lot of consternation about this process, how long it's taking, but I don't think it's a big deal. I know the Jets had, you could say the Jets had a head start on everybody else, but they really couldn't start interviewing candidates even virtually until the regular season ended. So the head start was really just getting your list ready and being able to immediately request interviews. The Jets really didn't have that big of an advantage over everybody else. Yesterday, the Jets interviewed two candidates. They interviewed Pittsburgh Steelers offensive coordinator Arthur Smith and Houston Texans offensive coordinator Bobby Slowik, who is, of course, preparing for a game this weekend against the Kansas City Chiefs. That's one of the things that makes this process really difficult, is that this is the biggest game of Bobby Slowik's career. And he's got to focus on preparing for the game, but he also has to prepare for a job interview. Makes life difficult, and it shows you why this NFL hiring process for head coaches tends to be very inefficient. And I don't really know what the solutions are for the league, but it's a really tough spot. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say Arthur Smith would not be a very exciting candidate. He was a guy who was in the mix for the Jets 4 years ago when they eventually hired Robert Saleh. He ended up getting the head coaching job with the Atlanta Falcons and proceeded to go 7-10 3 straight seasons. Now, Smith was in a tough spot because, he didn't really have great quarterback play. And that's a really important thing. If you don't have a good quarterback play, you really don't have a shot as a head coach. But guy was criticized frequently for, not great game management, questions about how he utilized players. I think based on what we've seen from Arthur Smith, he seems like the kind of guy who falls into the classic good coordinator, shaky head coach category. I thought he did a decent job this year with Pittsburgh. I know the end of their season was terrible, but I thought he actually was able to squeeze some decent production out of Russell Wilson. If you're of the mindset that Russell Wilson, getting anything out of Russell Wilson was good, maybe you can give Arthur Smith credit for that. But I think a guy who would not be a very exciting candidate. And then you have Bobby Slowik, who is the offensive coordinator of the Houston Texans, who was a hotter candidate a year ago after CJ Stroud's rookie season. Whenever somebody has some grand idea about the formula for hiring a successful head coach, I always am a little skeptical. And the whole Houston situation is exactly why, because what did the Jets do in 2021? And then what did everybody criticize them for? Everybody criticized them for they hired a first-time head coach, and then they drafted the quarterback 2 overall, and then they hired a first-time offensive coordinator. There's so much inexperience in this franchise. How could you think it would work? Well, what did the Jets do? They hired the San Francisco defensive coordinator. They hired the San Francisco passing game coordinator as their offensive coordinator, and they drafted a quarterback 2 overall. What did the Texans do? They hired the San Francisco defensive coordinator, DeMeco Ryans. They hired Slowik as their offensive coordinator, who, like Mike LaFleur before him, was the 49ers passing game coordinator, and they drafted a quarterback 2 overall, CJ Stroud. It shows you there's no magic formula for winning in this league. It shows you there's no magic formula for head coaching hires, because how many people have criticized the Jets process? Well, we hired all these inexperienced coaches and then drafted a quarterback. Well, that's what Houston did, and it's worked out for Houston. It's about the people. It's not about these tangential things. It's not about the biographical thing. As I said, Slowik was a very popular candidate a year ago. I think part of it is that he comes off the Kyle Shanahan tree, which is always in vogue when we talk about the way teams want to build their offenses. But my issue with Slowik is just maybe I'm wrong on this, but my perception's been that he's benefited a lot more from having CJ Stroud as his quarterback than CJ Stroud has benefited from having him as an offensive coordinator. I think sometimes coaches get too much credit when things go well for a player and too much blame when they go poorly for a player. CJ Stroud stepped in and was great right away. And CJ Stroud was, he was the number 2 overall pick. So it's not like this was a 5th round pick. I'm sure Slowik, there were certain things with Slowik's play calling. I'm sure there are certain things with his tutelage which have helped CJ Stroud along the way. But I don't know that CJ Stroud's career goes that differently if he has a different offensive coordinator. Maybe it goes differently if he goes to Carolina and is a completely dysfunctional setting his first year, the way Bryce Young was. But I mean, I think C.J. Stroud would be good in a lot of places. I mean, you drop C.J. Stroud onto the Jets in 2021. Is Mike LaFleur a hot head coaching candidate? I think perhaps, and it's not because Mike LaFleur was a great coach by any stretch of the imagination. It's just because, sometimes coaches get a little too much credit for the player who performs and take a little bit too much blame when the player doesn't perform. And that's especially true of the young quarterbacks. The young quarterbacks, falling into the right young quarterback can be a career maker, and falling into the wrong young quarterback can be a career breaker for these coaches. So, look, the Jets certainly can hear about Bobby Slowik's plans. Maybe he is a guy who understands what it takes to be a good head coach in this league. Maybe he's got an idea on how to assemble a program. But I gotta be honest, this is a guy I'm a little skeptical of. This is a guy who was really the flavor of the month a year ago, and then things haven't gone as well this year. So now it's amazing how, when his receivers get injured, suddenly he isn't an offensive genius. And it's not because it's not that he's gotten worse. It's just, again, sometimes sometimes we're a little bit too quick to assign credit or blame to coaches when ultimately it is a players' league. We'll see. It doesn't seem like either of these guys are really on the front burner. There have been some suggestions that Smith is a guy the Jets liked when they interviewed him 4 years ago. So there has been a little bit of buzz about him, which I'm a little concerned about. But we'll see. Slowik is not a guy who seems like he's on the top tier. Of course, it always depends on how well you interview, though. So wait and see, as always, with the Jets in this coaching search. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Friday, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.